In the sweltering midsummer of 1941, the world held its breath as the German Wehrmacht unleashed the colossal weight of Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. As panzer columns tore through the western borders of the USSR, a parallel storm was brewing in the Far East. In Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Army stood at a historic crossroads. For decades, a fierce ideological struggle had raged within the Japanese High Command between the Strike North faction, known as Hokushin-ron, and the Strike South faction, or Nanshin-ron. The Hokushin-ron faction, dominated by the army, viewed the Soviet Union as Japan's ultimate existential enemy, and argued that the vast resources of Siberia and the maritime provinces were the rightful prize of the empire. On July 7, 1941, only 2 weeks after the German invasion, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters authorized the mobilization of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria under the highly secretive cover name Kantokuen, or the Kwantung Army Special Maneuvers. Under the command of General Yoshijiro Umezu, this was not a mere exercise. It was the largest mobilization in the history of the Imperial Japanese Army, swelling the Kwantung Army to over 700,000 elite soldiers, 140,000 horses, and 600 combat aircraft. The plan was terrifyingly simple. Wait for the German advance to reach the Volga River, observe the collapse of the Red Army's western defenses, and then strike like a thunderbolt across the Amur River to seize Vladivostok, sever the Trans-Siberian Railway, and annex the Soviet Far East up to Lake Baikal. To the planners in Tokyo, the Soviet Far East appeared to be a ripe fruit waiting to be plucked, supposedly stripped of its best divisions to reinforce the desperate defense of Moscow. But this was a monumental miscalculation. Facing the Kwantung Army across the heavily fortified border was the Soviet Far Eastern Front, commanded by General Iosif Apanasenko. Apanasenko was a rough, hard-nosed veteran of the Russian Civil War who understood the cold mathematics of Siberian defense better than anyone in Moscow. He knew that the Soviet High Command was constantly demanding troops from his theater, but he also realized that any sign of weakness would instantly invite a Japanese invasion. To counter this, Apanasenko engaged in a brilliant, high-stakes game of strategic deception and brutal organizational discipline. When Stalin ordered him to send divisions west, Apanasenko complied, but he immediately built duplicate ghost divisions in their place. He mobilized the local Siberian population, forming divisions of coal miners, railway workers, and even pardoned Gulag prisoners. He ordered the construction of a parallel road network alongside the vulnerable Trans-Siberian Railway, ensuring that his defensive lines could be supplied even if the main rail lines were severed by Japanese saboteurs. While Tokyo believed the Far Eastern Front was hollowed out, Apanasenko actually maintained a formidable force of nearly 500,000 combat-ready soldiers, over 2,000 tanks, and a highly dense network of concrete border bunkers. It was a silent steel shield that stood ready to meet any Japanese advance with overwhelming defensive firepower. Had the order been given to launch Operation Kantokuen, the clashing military doctrines of the two empires would have resulted in an absolute slaughter. The Imperial Japanese Army of 1941 was an infantry-heavy force built on the fanatical spiritual doctrine of Seishin, which emphasized night attacks, bayonet charges, and the absolute superiority of the offensive spirit over material force. Tactically, the Kwantung Army was severely deficient in heavy artillery, logistical motor transport, and modern armor. Their primary tanks, the Type 97 Chai-Ha and the Type 95 Ha-Go, were lightly armored, poorly gunned, and intended for infantry support rather than high-intensity armored warfare. In sharp contrast, the Soviet Red Army in the Far East was a product of the combined arms deep battle doctrine developed by Georgy Zhukov. The memory of the 1939 Battle of Khalkhin Gol hung heavily over both sides. At Khalkhin Gol, Zhukov had used massed concentrated armor, heavy artillery, and coordinated airstrikes to completely surround and annihilate the Japanese 23rd Infantry Division, inflicting over 20,000 casualties. The Soviets in the Far East possessed massive quantities of heavy artillery and formidable armored units equipped with BT-7 fast tanks and early T-34s. Against the concrete fortifications of the Soviet Vladivostok defensive sector and the heavily mined border zones, the Japanese doctrine of frontal infantry assaults would have shattered against a wall of Soviet combined arms defense, turning the trackless forests of the maritime province into a vast graveyard for the elite of the Kwantung Army. An actual Japanese offensive into the Soviet Far East would have immediately degenerated into a brutal war of attrition in some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. The primary strategic objectives of Operation Kantokuen were to capture the critical port of Vladivostok and to seize the major administrative hub of Khabarovsk, thereby isolating the entire Soviet maritime province. The main Japanese thrust, led by the elite 5th and 20th Divisions, would have attempted to cross the Ussuri River and push through the narrow Khabarovsk Gap, a heavily fortified choke point between the Amur River and the Chinese border. Here, the Japanese infantry would have encountered the Soviet 1st Red Banner Army, dug into deep defensive belts, reinforced with heavy artillery batteries and formidable concrete bunkers. At the same time, the Japanese Navy would have attempted to blockade and bombard the naval fortress of Vladivostok from the sea, while Kwantung Army divisions launched a coordinated landward assault from northern Korea and eastern Manchuria. The terrain of the Soviet Far East, characterized by dense trackless taiga forests, treacherous swamps, and the towering Sikota-Alin mountain range, completely nullified any hope of a rapid Japanese blitzkrieg. The summer monsoons would have transformed the few dirt roads into impassable quagmires of deep mud, stranding the Japanese horse-drawn supply columns and leaving their infantry spearheads isolated, out of ammunition, and exposed to devastating Soviet artillery barrages and armored counterattacks. The ultimate fatal flaw of Operation Kantokuen lay in the unyielding laws of logistics. The Kwantung Army's offensive plans completely ignored the vast geographical distances and the total absence of transport infrastructure in the Soviet Far East. The entire Soviet defensive network was anchored by the Trans-Siberian Railway, a highly efficient, heavily fortified, double-track rail system that could rapidly shift troops and heavy armor across thousands of miles. The Japanese, on the other hand, relied almost entirely on horse-drawn transport and a severely limited fleet of poorly maintained trucks. As the Japanese divisions pushed deeper into Soviet territory, their supply lines would have stretched over hundreds of miles of trackless wilderness, creating a terminal supply deficit. Furthermore, on August 1st, 1941, the United States imposed a total oil embargo on Japan in response to its occupation of French Indochina. This embargo was a devastating strategic blow that instantly put a ticking clock on the Japanese military machine. Japan imported over 80% of its oil from the United States, and its strategic reserves were only sufficient to sustain a high-intensity war for less than 2 years. The Soviet Far East, while rich in timber and minerals, possessed virtually no developed oil fields or refineries in 1941. By striking north into Siberia, Japan would have committed its entire military force to a barren wilderness that could not solve its critical fuel crisis, while leaving its southern flanks completely exposed to Allied naval power. The decision to cancel Operation Kantokuen in late August 1941 was one of the most critical turning points of the Second World War. Had Japan proceeded with the invasion of the Soviet Union, the global strategic balance would have suffered a profound and catastrophic shift. In the West, the loss of General Apanasenko's ghost divisions and the complete cutting of the Trans-Siberian Railway would have prevented the Soviet High Command from transferring their elite Siberian divisions to the Western Front. Without these fresh, winter-hardened troops to launch the historic counter-offensive at Moscow in December 1941, the German Wehrmacht likely would have captured the Soviet capital, driving the Soviet government behind the Urals and dealing a near-fatal blow to the Soviet war effort. Yet, for Japan, the victory in Siberia would have been a Pyrrhic one. Starved of American oil, their mechanized forces and naval fleets would have gradually ground to a complete halt by late 1942. Without the resources of the Dutch East Indies, the Japanese Empire would have imploded from within, leaving their isolated armies stranded in the freezing wastes of Siberia, while the United States mobilized its colossal industrial might to wage a devastating war of liberation in the Pacific. Ultimately, Japan's decision to strike south instead of north was a choice dictated by the cold, unyielding realities of fuel shipping and industrial logistics. Operation Kantokuen remains the great, tragic gamble of the Kwantung Army, a vivid reminder that in the grand arena of global conflict, even the most fanatical offensive spirit must eventually surrender to the laws of